Hi everyone. Thank you. I'm Chetan. Thank you for being thank you all for being here today. It's a privilege to be presenting at Design Outlook, especially because Grant and team organized it with so much love. And I want to begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nation who are custodians of the land and waters on which we meet, and where I've spent the last 4 years doing my research project. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Please be advised that some imagery and ideas under discussion can be confronting. But you've probably already looked at what the talk is about. So my background is in design consulting and design history. I was looking to do an easy PhD on South Asian design history, but I was invited to come and work on death instead. I accepted this kind offer and started in September 2019. It was the first time that I worked in Australia and the first time that I worked in a hospital. I was struggling to understand how I, as a designer, could contribute to the subject of death when I started. Visiting the Peter MacCallum Cancer Center for a first project meeting left me feeling like an imposter. And, oops. So during the summer break in 2019, just before the onset of the pandemic, I went back home to India. And in Delhi, I went to a hospice called Shanti Avedna, and I connected with an NGO called Can Support. And the Can Support team, which included a nurse and a counselor, they allowed me to go on routine visits to patients. And over 2 days, I was able to visit 12 patients with them. And there's no way to talk about this experience, but it changed the way that I was thinking about my project. I also went to Varanasi in India, which is the city of death. And Hindus believe that dying in Varanasi liberates them from the cycle of birth and death. So it's a city which caters to the needs of the dying, people who have died, and the bereaved. And if you go to Varanasi, you can find death hotels, and you can find pyres that are burning continuously on the ghats of the holy river, Ganga. I documented my encounters in Varanasi with my GoPro, and I've edited that footage into a film. I'm not going to show that film today. Next, I traveled to Cambodia, which is a destination for death tourism because of the histories of genocide. And I visited the prison museum there. I also visited the killing fields. In Cambodia, I also observed and documented on film 3 funeral ceremonies, including those of high-ranking Buddhist monks who are next only to the royal family. And these kind of excursions into the field exposed me to cultural ways of constructing death. Back in Melbourne, I continued to visit places and events such as the Mexican Festival of the Dead, a cancer survivorship conference, death cafes, cemeteries, crematoriums, and hospitals. I went everywhere that I was allowed to enter, and that had anything to do with death and dying. So eventually a research practice at the intersection of design and healthcare began to take shape. And the practice explored what design can do on the topic of death inside the hospital. Because this was a PhD, my methodological approach included a literature review, hospital-embedded co-design, and a making practice. And that is what I'm going to talk about a little bit about each of these 3 elements. To quote the philosopher Paul Fairfield, when the subject is death, if it has truly not been said before by philosophers, artists, religious thinkers, and other mortals, it is probably not true, he says. The literature on death is absolutely fascinating. I conducted a systematic literature review across the social sciences, which means that I looked at the philosophy of death, the sociology of death, the anthropology of it, the physiology of it, and the psychology of death. I also looked at how death is spoken about in the humanities through works of poetry, prose, art, and cinema. The literature on death helped me in two ways. Firstly, it helped me identify and frame a project that is worth doing. On the slide, if you like, is a journey map representing the typical user experience. It illustrates that from the moment we are born, we are on a trajectory towards death. I realize that our existence is conditioned by our disposition towards death, and that our experience can be transformed or enhanced through an evolved awareness of it. Humans, amongst other species, have been doing death since way back. But over the past 100 years, death has been taken over by the hospital. And by claiming death, the hospital medicalizes it. But death and dying are a natural phenomena. They are profoundly personal experiences, and they require a holistic approach to care. The way we now construct death in contemporary society is very banal, and it is lacking in originality. The medicalization of death has made it undesirable. There is stigma attached to death, and talking about it is taboo. As we can no longer see death or talk about it, we've lost the socio-cultural know-how of dealing with it. And the invisibility of death impacts our ability to accept and confront our mortality. So how physician Ira Baidock observes that dying does not cause suffering. It is the resistance, the denial, the inability to accept, think, talk about, plan for, or confront mortality that is the cause of most suffering at end of life. And that is why my project aims to support better experiences at end of life by facilitating conversations about death and dying, and to decolonize death and to reclaim it back from the hospital. The second benefit of the literature review was that it allowed me to construct death theoretically. Death doesn't really exist, and so therefore it needed to be constructed. I curated my collection of ideas and concepts from literature into a visual cartography. I call it the Bioscope. The term translates from Latin to mean looking at life. And Bioscope maps the territory of death, and it has many locations or sites. Each of these sites can be used to situate conversations, different kinds of conversations. It embodies the code of the World Cafe or the Death Cafe format because it was designed to be used in those settings. It can also be used outside of it, but most people in Australia die in residential aged care and in hospitals. The palliative care setting of a hospital allows access to critical expertise and end-of-life practices. I took the Bioscope to Alfred Hospital to evaluate it and develop it via participant engagement. The overall strategy was to use the Bioscope to engage with caregivers and patients, following a first stage of development with palliative care practitioners, clinicians, nurses, allied health professionals, administrators. Developing the Bioscope with palliative care practitioners made it more sensitive to the needs of people at end of life. I did not involve patients or families in the co-design activity because they are vulnerable as research participants. I situated my project inside the hospital through securing a human research ethics approval from the hospital-based HREC committee. And my ethics application requested for 2 hours of clinician time because their time is precious. I conducted 2 digitally enabled workshops because it was during the pandemic. And Each workshop was an hour long, and I spaced them roughly 6 months apart so that it would allow me time for recruitment of participants, developing the prototype, and for managing the data, analyzing it, etc. It was an absolutely fantastic experience to explore, evaluate, and enhance the Bioscope with the clinicians. The workshop and data insights informed my final design of the Bioscope and its making. Alongside the project at Alfred Health Hospital, I also had another ongoing project at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Center. I wasn't sure if the ethics applications would go through, so I did two. And in addition to the clinicians, this study engaged palliative care volunteers, so that was a good experience to be able to interact with them, and most of them had lived experience in kind of care or having terminal illness. I also shadowed a doctor on his rounds of the palliative care unit. The Peter Mac has a recently inaugurated palliative care unit about 2-3 years back, and it's got 12 rooms and such. And the Peter Mac project explored what kind of an app or digital innovation would be useful to people at end of life. 6 kind of potential design trajectories emerged as an outcome, and I continue to muse upon these and develop them and in kind of variations or as a medtech startup. So it's something that's ongoing. But for the purposes of my PhD, the idea of prototyping the Bioscope held more gravitas. It was important to make it as an object because it is difficult to look into people's eyes and talk about death and dying. If you provide an object, it becomes an anchor, and then you can look at the object and talk freely, and it allows you to keep returning to the subject of the conversation. I like to make things, and the Bioscope it's making is a labor of love. I prototyped it as a tapestry on fabric. It's there downstairs, a part of it. It's dwarfed by the building, but it is between the green room and the makeup space. So if you want to have a look at it later, it's magnetic. You can pull it off and you can touch it and everything. So yeah, its making involved like over 600 hours of machine embroidery in the RMIT makerspace. So it was a lot of fun making it. It had to be beautiful, and because it had to make death accessible and invite people to engage with it. It also had to contain the infinite respect that is owed to the dying. And it had to be awe-inspiring, and I wanted it to hold space for contemplation, but I also wanted it to be able to give voice. My practice remakes death so that physicians, caregivers, patients inside the hospital can talk about death in a more sophisticated manner. There are many ways to talk about death, but the people who are wanting to say things are not very sure about the right way to say them. And it is hard to feel comfortable when talking about death and dying. So what my project does is the giving of permission. Having the Bioscope and using it gives agency to patients, to staff, to carers, to relatives, and to children, like my 2 little boys who are here, but they've probably stepped out. And then when I finished making it on a Thursday afternoon in October 2023, last year, I took the Bioscope back to the Alfred Hospital to show it to the doctors, and they really loved it, and they wanted to use it with patients. And during the workshop, I've included the quote here. I could have talked about it during the co-design, but one physician said that it's invaluable to have these discussions. And he said that we don't have enough of them. And more importantly, he said that clinicians don't possess the skills to have these discussions. And that the Bioscope and the sites were a good way to explore these avenues and to get to those fruitful discussions into what the true values of the patients might be. And the director of palliative care, who, of course, facilitated the project, and I had pitched it to her at that last meeting, said that it's something that should find its way into all hospitals and hospices and palliative care settings in Australia, and this was a big win for me. I don't know if it will happen, but my supervisors are excited about that, but it needs grant funding, so it may take a few years. but the next stage is for me to try and make the Bioscope accessible and to embed it in community-based settings and to evaluate its impact. And I'm working with the Thomastown is like a neighborhood house which is close to my house to set up a pro bono death cafe at the local library. So our first monthly session will be in August. Thank you. And I hope that some of you too will choose to experience the Bioscope and that it will shift the way that you think about death and dying. And I'm convinced that an evolved awareness of death can help us to accept our own mortality. It can also, very importantly, help us live more authentically, and it can inspire us to be compassionate towards others. Thank you. Thank you.